Um, the Glasgow School of Art has long been famous for very, very good reasons. Um, I admired it when I was teaching. I came to admire it when I was teaching architects about structure. Um, not so much for its structural virtuosity or anything like that, but just because of its architectural form. And I was very interested in um, the sort of the end of the arts and crafts movement, particularly the kind of um, shifted symmetries that you get. You can see a few of them around the entrance there. There are lines of symmetry which go partway up the facade, and then other lines of symmetry take over. And that kind of dynamic composition of a facade, I thought was a very fruitful exercise. So before long, I headed off to Glasgow, initially on my own, just to go and have a look. And as usual, got to Glasgow on a wet and rainy day. And the photograph on the screen gives you an unrealistic idea about the width, certainly in those days, the width of the street. It was nowhere near possible to get that close, that far enough away from the building to take a photograph like that. But never mind, it was wonderful. I then did what I normally do in these circumstances, which is walk into the building and keep going and having a look around till somebody stops me. And nobody stopped me, so I had a good wander around the building. And then a few years later, I took a party of students up to Glasgow, and we knew Andy Macmillan and Izzy Metstein, who were well, Andy was professor of architecture. And so we actually stayed with camping on their floors, groups of students. I went with Dean Hawkes, who some of you will know, and we had a good wander round and a talk on the Glasgow School of Art from Andy Macmillan. Then, when Frank Newby was convener of the group, he also knew Andy Macmillan, and he arranged a study group visit to Glasgow. I forget exactly when, but sometime in the 80s. And he arranged for us to go, not only go round the building, but to have dinner served in, I think, the director's room, which was slightly surprising for this such a masculine building. The color scheme of the decoration of the director's room, I felt, was quite feminine. That doesn't stop it being quite wonderful. And in particular, with the students, we had been to explore the library, and then went to the gallery. I can't remember where it is now, which contains all of remains of the collection of Mackintosh's furniture, and saw some of the items in there. Anyway, so I was really saddened to hear about it burning down during its refurbishment. And of course, even more sad to hear that getting towards the end of that first refurbishment contract, it burnt down again. Anyway, Dominic Echlin has been looking after its structure, and I look forward to hearing about it, Dominic. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that introduction. I've been involved at the Glasgow School of Art for just over 10 years now. I got a phone call in late May in 2014. Actually, it was the afternoon of the first fire from Brian Park of Patron Park, asking me to stand by to visit as soon as it was possible to do so, to begin the process making that assessment after the 2014 fire. And I sort of remained in harness, as it were, until 2018 in June, when there was the second far more catastrophic and destructive fire. And I've been intensely involved ever since, initially with the immediate advice to the fire service, and then Glasgow City Council on whether or not the building was going to fully collapse and whether it could be saved, and then in the sort of complex process of stabilizing the shell and then progressively moving inside the building to stabilize the structure and to clear the building of debris. So in that process, I've inevitably learned a huge amount about the building. Not only from sort of research and an awful lot of reading. There's a fantastic collection of books on the Glasgow School of Art and the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. But as well as that sort of background research, also an intensive exercise of looking at the building, investigating the building, looking at how it's constructed, looking at the materials that it was constructed from, both from a point of view to help inform the repair work in post 2014 and 2015, but also to understand how the structure was working, how it had been impacted by the fire, how the materials had been affected by the fire. And so I, and actually the whole team that have been working on the building since 2014, have gained I think, a sort of a unique set of information and knowledge about what anyway is a very, very important late 19th, early 20th century building. I should start this talk this evening just by making a few acknowledgements and acknowledging some references that I've used and drawn on for putting together this talk, particularly some of the images. And so I've listed them there. Obviously, the great archive at the School of Art themselves, the fantastic University of Glasgow Mackintosh architecture project. If you want to know anything about Mackintosh, and go to all the sources of the drawings and the day books and specifications, it's all amazingly digitized and there on their website. And then as I should acknowledge also Page and Park architects who were involved in the first restoration project between 2014 and 2018. They prepared some fantastic information. And then I've name checked some of the key publications about the art school. I particularly would do a call out to the most recent of them, which is the Mack, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and the Glasgow School of Art by Robin Calvert. Robin Calvert is always working with the Glasgow School of Art as one of their lecturers, and she joined the design team as part of a working group in the post 2014 project, and we had many an interesting conversation about the development of the design and the construction technology. And her book really is fantastic because it includes a lot of information about the work that was done post 2014. In most people's minds now, sadly, the Glasgow School of Art is identified with the events of 2014 and 2018, the two fires. And in some ways, I think certainly at the moment, that possibly such dramatic events perhaps obscure the building in terms of how interesting it is and its importance, not only from an architectural point of view, but also I think sort of how interesting it is from a construction and structure point of view. So hopefully this evening I'll be able to take you beyond these rather dramatic and awful images to show you some of what remains and also some of the fantastic information that we're being gathered as we've worked on the recovery of the building. The Glasgow School of Art as an architectural design has been recognised as being seminally important in 20th century and modern architecture for quite some time. In fact, it was Nicholas Pevsner in his book Pioneers of Modern Movement, published in 1936, who was really the first person to recognise the importance of the building, in fact declaring it was the first modern building in Europe, which I think even perhaps at the time that Pevsner was saying that might seem to be quite an unusual thing to say. In most people's minds, I think we associate the Glasgow School of Art as being an arts and crafts building, harking back more perhaps to the later 19th century design. But there are many elements of the design and, as I'll illustrate this evening, many elements of the construction and the use of the materials that definitely place the building as being a modern building. Slightly more negatively, Morton P. Shand said at about the same time that whilst recognising that it was the most original architectural design of its day, he felt that structurally the building was behind contemporary engineering practice. I only recently came across that quote, and I do think now that perhaps that's something that needs revisited, because it's not, it's definitely not as a building that far behind much of the contemporary work that was happening both in Glasgow and the rest of the country. Again, I think it's possibly the reputation of the building, certainly from a construction and engineering point of view, is possibly obscured by that sort of perception of it being a masterpiece of arts and crafts design. And here are just a few sort of kind of illustrations of what I mean by that. There's really some quite innovative use of different types of construction and material to start to create a very different sort of building. The image on the left-hand side is actually in one of the first floor studios. And there were two banks of studios on either side of the main entrance. And the fascinating thing about these studios is that whilst they were designed as separate spaces, they could in fact all be opened from across an entire half of the building into one single space. There's a very clever system of suspended, the upper part of the partitions is suspended from the beams above, and the lower part of the partition was entirely demountable, so that the space could, all of the spaces, studio spaces, could be opened up into one large volume. The arrangement in the middle of the windows to those studios is also, I think, sort of interesting. It's certainly pushing the boundaries in terms of creating the maximum amount of north light into the studios and also introducing top light. And there also on the right hand side, there's an image of one of the clever little details, a system of steel hangers supported from the steel grids of beams, which enabled there to be in various parts of the building suspended mezzanine floors, again allowing the spaces below to be completely uninterrupted. So some quite clever use of different types of construction and the modern materials of the day to create a rather different sort of building and different sorts of spaces internally. As part of the work that we've done since 2014, we've done a huge amount of investigation of materials, and basically almost every single material in the building has been carefully identified and analysed in order that we understood what the materials were. Well, even our team going into the project, I think perhaps made some assumptions that perhaps didn't turn out to be the case. And also the purpose of the material analysis investigation was to understand very clearly the properties of the material, to some degree how those properties might have been affected by the fire, so that we could then take that information and that would inform the sort of repair and recovery of the building. I'll run through a bit of sort of the history of the building, because it in itself is quite interesting. And we, in the process of investigating and looking at the building, we've found some very good evidence of how the building was built and developed during its construction. The idea of having a sort of a dedicated art school building for Glasgow developed in the sort of 1870s and particularly 1880s, when at a time when Glasgow was booming as a city, and a recognised sort of arts community was developing in Glasgow. The Glasgow Arts Club had been established in the I think it was the 1870s. As an image on the right hand side at the bottom there. And so the notion of having a dedicated arts school, a new building, became increasingly important, and it was seen perhaps not as we might see an art school today, as being just perhaps for sort of artists producing work, fine art, etc. It was very much seen as being an important part of the sort of commercial and productive development of Glasgow, to having an art school covering all of the arts disciplines and not just orientated for producing art for rich patrons, but also for producing products and designs that could be used in Glasgow's manufacturing. The school or the committee that sought to build the school identified a site in what was then the developing sort of western side of Glasgow, and initially a scheme was proposed to develop a site just alongside the Corporation of Glasgow's new art galleries, the McLennan Galleries. But it was quickly recognised that the site identified wasn't really big enough, and actually that there would be much better value in building a large dedicated building, rather than it just being an adjunct to an existing gallery. And so a site was identified a little bit further along the area that's known as Garnet Hill, just above Sauchiehall Street. An interesting kind of period in the development of that part of Glasgow. It initially developed as a series of plots with large mid-Victorian villas. But at the time that the art school was being promoted for this site, the area was already changing. It was becoming more commercial. There were more institutional buildings being constructed. And today, if you go to that part of the Glasgow, it's certainly not an area of villas. It's much more a large commercial building and institutional building part of Glasgow. In good late sort of Victorian fashion, they formed a committee of the Board of Trustees of the Glasgow School of Art, which included a number of important Glasgow architects, and they put together a quite ambitious brief for what they wanted from the new school. It was inevitably a brief that they quite quickly identified that they couldn't actually afford. In fact, several of the architects who set to enter the competition that was launched promptly turned to the board and told them that there was no way that they could produce an entry that would meet the budget of £14,000. The board got round this rather cleverly by saying, well, okay, present us with a overall scheme and then tell us how much you can build for £14,000. And this is why the development of the building that then proceeded was done in a series of phases. But that overall competition for design for the full school was won by a firm called Honeyman and Keppie, but their chief draftsman and the person responsible for the design was a young Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And these are some of the drawings that he prepared for that competition entry. A full scheme for the whole art school, developed in quite a lot of sort of detail, not just the sort of external elevations, but even some elements of the sort of how the building was to be constructed. And you will see elements of this original design in the finished building, albeit that the design subsequently went through some quite significant changes over the 10 to 15 year period and the two phases of construction. Some of those elements of the sort of the design, which I touched on earlier, I really sort of marking this as being a modern building, are there in that original design. Certainly the sort of concept of these large internal spaces, uninterrupted spaces, generally north lit, were there as part of that original design. This the image is of the architecture studio as finished, and it occupies the sort of the what's in fact is the ground floor, sort of the raised ground floor space on the western half of the building. But this was typical of the sort of large studio spaces that form part of that original design. So as I said, there was this restriction on the budget. Initially, the school only had the £14,000, so they were forced to accept the fact that the building was going to be built in phases. And what Mackintosh was able to achieve for that £14,000 was the construction of the eastern end of the building, the three windowed studio spaces, and the main entrance hall, and at the rear the southeast wing, which contained the original boardroom. That's the room that Andrew referred to, and the main gallery space within the building, which was often referred to also as the museum. The second phase of work progressed a little under sort of 10 years after the first phase, once the board had raised the further funds needed. And this diagram usefully explains how that development was then completed across the second phase. It obviously included the western half of the building, but it also included some quite significant changes to the eastern half of the building. In particular, as originally constructed, the eastern half had a sort of a timber roof, which was removed, and to then match the western half, an additional story of studio space was added on top of the building. This was in part due to actually the kind of the success of the school and it needing more accommodation relatively quickly. And in order to sort of kind of achieve that extra story, what was done was the existing timber roof was removed, and then a concrete filigree slab was put across the building at that what is now referred to as the second floor level, across both east and western halves, and the extra story of Northlit Studios added. Another major change that occurred with the building of the second phase was sort of recognition of some of the problems actually of the original design and the eastern half as built. Principally the sort of the lack of staircases. As originally built, the eastern part, the first phase of the building, only had a single open stair just behind the entrance hall. And both from a sort of circulatory point of view, but also as you recognise from a fire escape point of view, this was highly unsatisfactory. So what they did was they added in two additional stairs, one as part of the building of the western half of the building, but then they added in another stair tower tucked into the return corner of the southeast corner block of the first phase. And then a sort of a third element of the sort of kind of unification of the two halves, as it were, was to form a connection at the roof level. Mackintosh added what was referred to as the hen run. This is a sort of a cantilevering glazed corridor that wraps around the back of the entrance block above the museum roof, connecting the two top level studios together. So quite a sort of a complex sort of development of the form of the building. The other thing that we sort of see in this period, this 10-year period between the two phases, are some quite significant changes in some of the materials used in the construction. And those changes have, in some cases, have only really come to light following the fires, and we've actually been able to see in detail how the building was constructed. The major change is a much more consistent steel grid to the floors in the western half of the building, and in fact part of the north facade actually supported on a steel frame of beams and columns at low level. So we're seeing over this period not only changes in the design of the form of the building, but also changes in how the building was actually constructed and the materials used. So these are just a couple of images around that construction period. Interesting enough, there were almost no images of the building during construction. There's an excellent set of high quality photographs, I think by a chap called Bedford Lemaire, who I think took them originally for Country Life, or certainly they were used in Country Life magazine very early on. But there's virtually, we haven't really found any images of the building under construction, which I find interesting. Perhaps it's because construction in Glasgow at that point wasn't thought as being particularly out of the ordinary and therefore worthy of someone taking a photograph. But if anyone ever turns up a photograph of the Glasgow School of Art being built, I would be very, very interested. But these are a couple of early images. One is a postcard showing just the eastern half of the building, and on the right is a rather nice Muirhead Bone sketch showing the library tower under construction. And we can see some of the evidence of those sort of design changes in the building. Some of them were elements evident before the fire. The bottom left-hand image is in the east stair, and where you had this rather curious arrangement of the east stair, which was added after the eastern half was built, sort of wrapping around what had been the external windows to one side of the director's boardroom. But with the destruction caused by the fire, we can actually see more of the detail of the sort of changes in that same bit of wall, sort of original arched openings being altered and raised to form a doorway from the stair landing into the space, and with the removal, and in some cases the falling away of the finishes within the stair, actually the original external harling or render on that elevation around those now blocked over windows, still on the wall underneath the later finishes on the stairs. And there's lots of other examples of these changes and adaptations to the structure and construction that have been revealed following the fires. One of the most interesting things I think about the building is the sort of various types of material and construction that are used in the building. And unlike Mr. Shand's quote, I think this is very much a building of its time. As we've investigated the construction and the materials, it's become very clear to us not only was there a great deal of change and adaptation in construction practice around the turn of the 20th century in Glasgow, but that Mackintosh, as an architect, was evidently extremely interested in construction materials and technology, and was obviously very keen to use the most up-to-date forms of construction and materials that he could get his hands on. I mean, the same also applies to other types of building technology. I haven't included in tonight's talk details about the electrical systems in the building and the heating and ventilation, because they are talk in themselves. But Mackintosh was incorporating within the building and adapting the construction through those design phases, all these new materials and ways of building. He seems to be particularly keen on cement, as we find it used in varying different forms throughout the building. As I said, as part of the sort of changes between the two phases was the introduction of concrete filler joist floors at the second floor level. That's this upper level up here. But he was already using concrete to form ground slabs, and also some of the sort of corridor slabs. One of the differences between the two phases is that in the eastern half of the building, all of the corridor floors were in fact timber, but by the time he comes to build the western half of the building, he's building all of those floors in using concrete filler joist construction. As obviously this type of construction had been around for a while, but its more extensive use in the second phase clearly indicates that they were thinking about the sort of the issues of fire and where this construction was perhaps preferable over timber floors. What we also see in the western half of the building is with parts of the structure, particularly the north facade, supported more on steel framing. There's more use of concrete in the sort of foundations of the building, presumably because of the much increased point loads from those columns and frames. But Mackintosh was also very interested in cement and concrete products as an aesthetic material. This is an example again on the stairs where he uses it in a form of a polished plaster that's often referred to as Glasgow marble, because it can be finished very, very finely, and he uses this quite carefully in very key areas of the building, particularly on the stairs, and he's clearly using it as a decorative material. He's using this high quality polishable render for its aesthetic qualities. In its original form, it would have been much lighter. The photograph on the left-hand side is one taken just after the building was finished. The other photographs are relatively, or just taken just prior to the 2014 fire, where it's taken on a much darker hue. But clearly, it's a very careful aesthetic decision to use this modern material in the design. So I think I've lost a slide. Oh yes, I'll go back a slide. The other key area where Mackintosh uses a cement material is on the south facade of the building. If you cast your mind back to that first slide where I showed the north facade, the south facade is radically different. It's been sort of compared to a bit like a sort of a Scots tower house, in this extensive use of render, almost only very little bits of stone at high level, and the render wrapping over window sills and wall heads. And that unified, almost sort of featureless look to the south facade is understood to be why Mackintosh wanted to use this sort of uniform render. The image on the right hand side is, in fact, is another Mackintosh design, the Hill House at Helensburgh, where he, in the same way, he uses this render to over almost all the external wall surfaces. And for this exercise, Mackintosh uses almost a sort of pure cement render, because at the time this produced this amazingly clean and unifying texture to the surface of the wall. Obviously, traditionally, this would have been done using a sort of a lime render, but Mackintosh wanted this very, very clean, uniform finish, and so he adopted a sort of almost pure cement material. Has caused a certain amount of problems, particularly at the Hill House, where they are struggling with the problems of damp and water ingress that come with using such a hard cement render. One of the interesting changes we can see in the development of the across the two phases of the building is the initial use of cast iron to form some of the larger structural elements, particularly the lintels over the large north facade studio windows. There is only cast iron on the eastern part of the building. By the time of the building of the second phase, the larger steel sections were commonly in use, and so the use of these large section cast iron beams isn't followed through. Also, cast iron is used in some of the first phase construction to form very, very shallow lintels. The image on the left hand side is a piece of one of the lintels. It's probably about, I want to say it's about 6 inches deep. and these were typically spanning, in some cases, 7 or 8 feet. But this technology is old hat by the time the construction of the second phase, and there's almost no use of cast iron in that second part of the building. One of the interesting things that we've been able to see, in fact, sort of one of the beams had to be removed. It was actually the one above the centre of the building, and as part of the dismantling post the fire of 2018, that beam had to be taken down, and we've used that opportunity to investigate the material and to test the beam to see what the potential is for hopefully being able to repair and reuse some of those cast iron elements. But it was interesting when cleaned up. This is not damage caused by the fire or the building over nearly 100 years. This was the quality of the casting at the time, which was, I must admit, was a little bit of a surprise. The shallower sections were clearly a much better casting, but the large beams were somewhat rough and ready. And we found some interesting use of cast iron in some other places that we weren't even aware that it was there. There's a number of points on the building where there are these windows with large cantilevering blocks of stone immediately above them. And in fact, with the dismantling of parts of the facade at high level, we found not immediately above the window opening, but in some cases 1 or 2 courses above, these carefully shaped pieces of cast iron acting as sort of relieving lintels or supports to hold the projecting element of stonework above those window openings. So some quite clever use of different types of cast iron section to achieve the architectural form. As I said, there is quite a significant development over the 2 phases in terms of the use of steel in the building. There is some steel used in the eastern half of the building, although it was obviously limited by what was available in the mid 1890s. There's the main floor beams in the eastern half of the building supporting the studio floors are steel, but they are sort of fully compound sections made up of plates and angles riveted together. And by the time of the construction of the second phase of the building, we're seeing that very definite sort of transition that was sort of happening about across the UK at the same time, of this transition to a more formalized steel framing of buildings and use of larger rolled beam sections. And clearly the use of steelwork in the building was an important element of Mackintosh's designs, and he clearly wanted to push the use of the material, both structurally and in some instances also architecturally. But this was part of a sort of general transition that was happening not only in Scotland but across the rest of the UK at that time. And just to illustrate sort of where that transition was going, the building in the centre of the building is the Forsyth's department store in Edinburgh, which in fact was built almost exactly the same time as the second phase of the School of Art, and that's credited as being the first fully steel framed building in certainly in Edinburgh and also I think sort of Scotland. The second phase of the School of Art doesn't quite go that far, but you are certainly getting this much more consistent use of larger single rolled sections and more consistent grid of steelwork to form the floors, rather than just individual beams that we find in the eastern half of the building. And as I said, Mackintosh in the second phase makes more use of steelwork. He supports the sort of bottom part of the north facade on the western half on a system of steel beams and columns that allowed him to push the lower level studios out and occupy the basement area. And his designs for the second phase also include some steel roof trusses. These roof trusses, in fact, were never built. This was a truss design for one of the studios towards the back to the southern side of the building, which ended up with a much more arts and craft timber truss roof. But it's interesting that Mackintosh's quite detailed drawings for those studios, as intended in the start of construction in 1907, were for use of steel trusses, and clearly sort of wanting those to be exposed, and using the steelwork in a decorative way. I haven't got an image here, but the one vestige of this use of exposed steelwork in a sort of decorative way does appear in the studio where this roof was originally intended, in the form of T-brackets that support the timber trusses extending from the wall. And Mackintosh takes the T section and cuts the end of the steel and has it bent and sculpted into these sort of, they look a little bit like flowers. So so he wasn't afraid of using the material, exposing the material, and then taking that as a decorative element. And these are some other images of the steel structure in the western half of the building. Obviously, these are in the aftermath of the second fire, when the timber floors that these steel grids were supporting have all burnt away. But you can see the sort of the layout of the main girders and then the secondary beams, and some of the sort of the detailing. And this is very much reflective, obviously, of sort of what was going on in terms of construction and what was being produced, the steelwork being produced in Glasgow and across the rest of the UK at that time. The external image of the Glasgow School of Art, I think most people today would think of being as rather traditional. It is a sandstone building, much in common with the vast majority of the buildings around Garnet Hill and throughout Glasgow and Scotland. But Mackintosh chooses to develop his design and construct elements of the facade in a very, very different way from how they would have constructed masonry facades even well into the 20th century, particularly for the part of the facade around the tall library windows. Mackintosh adopted a form of construction that consisted of a jigsaw puzzle of large monolithic stone blocks, individually sculptured, to then form the overall facade design. So rather than constructing it with just an external face of ashlar stone, carved ashlar stone with a more traditional sort of rubble backing, he adopts this large block construction. And the details of this only sort of kind of revealed itself following the first fire, when the first fire particularly affected the library, and as it vented out the window, it caused quite a lot of damage to the stonework around those windows. And as part of the repair exercise, we took the opportunity, in fact, to dismantle those piers once we had determined that they were constructed of these large blocks. And so we were able to investigate and understand this very, very clever jigsaw puzzle. One of the wonderful details that we found is in this block in the top right-hand photograph. You can see this little line. That in fact is the mason's original wax crayon line that was drawn across the stone, which allowed them to align very, very subtly each block one above the other to create the overall sculptural effect. So very nice little detail that we were able to find. Not well, in some degrees not structural, although there are structural elements of this, but particularly interesting, I think, are the windows for the art school, which again show that Mackintosh was following the developments in particularly materials and the use of materials to form windows for the art school. There's a variety of window elements on the building. There's obviously the large north studio windows. These are relatively conventional, despite their size. They are just made up of very quite chunky timber elements. And for that part of the design, obviously developed for the first phase and then continued in the second. It's more about the sort of the scale of the window and its relationship with the north light. But with the development of the second phase, there were some more challenging window solutions that needed to be developed. The addition of the first floor studios, Mackintosh incorporates this almost continuous glaze screen on the north side of those studios at the top of the building. These are also constructed in timber, but clearly this was kind of pushing the limits of what a normal jointed timber window, even one that was very, very well built, was capable of. It was interesting in as part of the post 2014 fire project, we had to reconstruct the top floor studios and reconstruct these timber glazed screens. And we found it incredibly difficult. We found it very, very difficult to justify how they worked against wind load. And the joiners that were contracted to make them had great difficulty themselves in working out how to detail them. It wasn't unsurprising because actually there'd been quite a long history of problems of these windows leaking, almost certainly because because of their scale and the size of the timber sections and how they were detailed. They really weren't sort of stiff enough to deal with the wind loads and the deflections to avoid them leaking. Similar sort of timber construction was used for the hen run, which is the image up in the top right hand corner. This amazing sort of glazed corridor that sort of sailed above the roofs on the south side of the building, connecting the two top floor studios. But a very beautiful and elegant piece of sort of timber construction. And then elsewhere on the sort of western half of the building, with the Mackintosh adds these various sort of bay window structures, and this is where he starts to move away from using timber and starts to use metal framed windows. The use of metal in the windows in the eastern half of the building is only in the form of sort of your traditional arts and crafts, sort of leaded light type elements and some of the smaller windows. By the time of the construction of the western part of the building, Mackintosh is venturing into using fully metal frames in its most adventurous way for the windows to the west facade, in particular the extraordinary windows to the library that sail over nearly 3 stories in height, and these were made up of um, steel framed elements there. In fact, actually, the image on the left hand side is actually the windows that replaced the original design. The windows on the west were actually fully replaced in about 1948. The original design, which is shown in the center image, is a much finer steel section, and using the individual sections and effectively stacking them up and connecting them together, really without any other form of frame elements to them. Certainly very, very up to date, and obviously prescient of the sort of kind of glazing solutions that were then kind of adopted in what we might think of as the first modern buildings. But very interesting use of sort of the latest technology, and making that very much an element of the design of the building. Finally, I'm going to say a little bit this evening about the library. The library occupies the two floors within the southwest corner block of the building, and probably was one of the most significant architectural spaces within the building. I'm sure all of you will have seen images of the library space. The library interior, sadly, was completely destroyed in the first fire, but we had the opportunity in the aftermath of the first fire to do a really forensic exercise to understand how the library interior was constructed, with a view to seeing whether we will be able to recreate that interior as close as possible to the original design. And we, Page and Part Architects, undertook an incredibly detailed exercise of identifying and determining the construction of that whole interior. There were fortunately quite a lot of drawings and records for the library. I think every architectural student who'd ever gone through the School of Art had probably been asked to do a measured drawing of either part of it or some detail. So we had all that information, but we also, by getting archaeologists to literally sift through the debris that was left within that part of the building, we retrieved all sorts of elements of the construction. This, in fact, is a part of it was actually a timber framed glazed panel that stood behind some of those west facade windows. And it's just one example of one of the fragments of the timber construction that we were able to recover, and then able to measure and get details of all the elements were put together. And that allowed us, with Page and Park, to construct a full 3D model of the library interior construction. And alongside this, we had a sort of a component list where we identified, I think there were over 700 different elements of timber that made up this interior. And at the end of the exercise, it was really only a handful where we didn't know the dimensions or how one element to another. It was quite an extraordinary exercise, and the level of detail we got to what was really impressive. And so what that enabled us to do was to undertake a reconstruction of that library interior. Starting from that knowledge of what all the individual components were and how they were arranged. We spent a lot of time looking at how elements were fixed and connected. That proved to be very interesting because it wasn't as we quite expected. I think a lot of people looking at some of the iconic images of the library interior would have assumed that it was a beautifully joined piece of timber construction, anything but. It was basically held together by a bunch of nails, and it was all about Mackintosh just using the different sort of rectangular forms of different cut bits of timber, and just simply bringing those together as an assembly. And I think there's one detail which has a sort of a dowel, a dowel type connection to it. Almost all of the rest of it is largely nails, and the odd screw. And only specific decorative elements like the balusters and the sort of carved pendants. Another very interesting kind of discovery was what the library, what timber the library was constructed from. Huge amount of archive research was done, poring through the original specifications, seeing how the specification was endlessly being discussed at the board meetings, and how the original choice of timber, which was oak, was proving to be too expensive, and back and forth between Mackintosh and the board, and then finally deciding on what they were going to use. And then when the test results came back from Trada for the samples that we sent away for testing, it turned out that it was something completely different. That had been used was a timber called tulip wood, which a very knowledgeable modern day timber supplier referred to us as being the sort of early 20th century version of MDF. It was basically what furniture makers used for the backs of wardrobes. And this all sort of suddenly kind of made sense, because obviously with all of those massive cost constraints, what Mackintosh does is he goes off and he finds the cheapest material that he can get his hands on, so that he can then maximize the use of the money in realizing the overall design. But the consequence of that exercise was we were then with Page and Park were able to develop the details, informed by that research and informed by the material testing and the investigations done on site, to embark on the sort of reconstruction of the library in timber. And these are some photographs that were taken in the month or so just before the second fire, showing that library interior being reconstructed within the library space, including the suspended floor to the space above the library that also supports the library ceiling. And so that was where we had got to at the point of the second fire, in terms of bringing all that knowledge and information that we'd learned about the building together to inform the reconstruction. And hopefully, and we're starting on what will inevitably be a much longer journey, but hopefully that information can be brought forward into the reconstruction of the building a second time round. Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much, Dominic. I had never had an inkling that there was so much complexity of construction. I did notice when we went round the library that it had been essentially that the joinery was all planted. All the sections were very simple rectangles planted one on another to build up these complex forms. And yes, so, as you say, economic, but actually visually very effective.
Yeah.
Anyway, are there any questions? If people could raise a hand, anybody who'd like to ask a question?
Andrew, there's a question there from Mark Watson in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
With the benefit here of 2 phases of construction, can you comment on the relative performance of cast iron and steel against fire and saturation by water?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably we've had problems with the cast iron in the second fire. As many of you will know, cast iron is not particularly forgiving when it heats up, or particularly when it cools down. And in some of those main girders, in fact, particularly the one towards the if you can still see on the screen, the sort of towards the east end of the building, we have one of the beams which has a spectacular fracture that over the course of about 3 weeks increased from about a couple of millimeters to a size you can now stick your hand in. And that was fairly typical of sort of what happened to most of the cast iron beams on that east facade. They all have some form of fracturing. I mean, part of the process of doing the load testing was really to understand whether that fracturing is sort of fatal in terms of those beams, or whether actually some of them may be recoverable. Interestingly enough, some of those shallow lintels behaved rather differently. I think possibly because they weren't subject to such rapid cooling down. Obviously, on the external facade was being sprayed with water by the fire service, but some of those internal lintels didn't fracture. But I've never seen this before with cast iron, but they did actually bend quite dramatically, which can only be that they were able to cool down much more slowly, and so avoided fracturing, perhaps also because they were clearly much better castings with fewer original flaws. The steelwork up to a certain temperature in the western half of the building has survived reasonably okay. The problem with the steel is where the temperatures became very elevated, it becomes incredibly flexible and has twisted in some cases really quite dramatically. So sort of different issues for the different materials. It's probably fair to say we're based on the testing and analysis we've done, we're hopeful of being able to retain some of the steel elements in the western half of the building, and with a fair wind, we may be able to recover a few of the bigger cast iron elements.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dominic, can you give us some idea of the intended timescale for the second reconstruction?
It's going to be a while. We've currently got to a point where we have detailed up the structural repairs for the shell that is standing. We've actually started an element of that work, and that's envisaged to probably run for 2 to 3 years. The longer term project will be a while beyond that. I don't know. I don't have exact ideas of sort of timescales. It's as have been noted in the press. There are issues to do with the insurance claim. The school are currently undertaking a review of the sort of longer term sort of plan and use of the building, what they sort of refer to as the business case. There was an overall business case put together for the whole school campus a number of years ago, which did include the Mack, how the Mackintosh building was going to be taken forward, and they're taking the opportunity at this point to sort of refresh that. And out of that exercise, which it sort of started a number of weeks ago, again has been noted in the press, out of that exercise will become a much clearer picture as to sort of how the school feel they can take the project forward, what its aims will be in terms of a restoration, reconstruction, and also the sort of time scales associated with that.
Right. Are there any other questions? We have run rather over at the moment. So
I have one more, not a question, but a point, which I think is that Andrew Jackson researched early steel frames in Scotland and north of England, and found the Scotsman building, also in Edinburgh, built in 1902, to be the first properly steel frame by his standards. So that pushes it back a few more years.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Yeah. Dominic, there's a question in the chat from Andy Hyde. The facade appears to be of stone. Is it? And has it survived?
Yeah, the principal facades are all to the east, north, and west are all of sort of stone masonry. The one exception to that is if you can still see on the screen, it's sort of the last 3 bays to the west end of the building are in fact supported on a steel frame for the bottom story, because as part of that second design, the sort of the studio space extends out across the sort of covered over basement area. So in fact, the last 3 bays of the western part of that north facade are sat on a steel frame, but the rest of the facade is facades on those 3 principal elevations is stone masonry coming to ground. It's interesting when you come around the back of the building, the southern facade is all brickwork and rendered. So the sort of rendered facades are brickwork rather than stonework, and the main internal walls are all brick masonry as well. So the kind of the use of the sort of 2 materials, depending on whether the walls were the wall material was exposed externally or not.
Did you find that a lot of the stone had spalled or fractured due to the differential temperature?
Yes, and we and as part of the repair work on the west facade after the first fire, we did sort of an extensive analysis of that problem. What we discovered, rather interesting, was that the original sandstone is actually really quite weak. It was right at the bottom end of kind of what we were certainly today we would sort of think as a decent structural sandstone. In some ways, that possibly helped it a bit in terms of the sort of the how it reacted to the temperature. But what we found was that the stone was affected really on sort of kind of 3 different levels. There were individual. I mean, it was obviously that surface spalling and fracturing that was extending through multiple stones. On the sort of petrographic level, there were problems because of particularly the feldspar in the sandstone mix, which tends to expand more than the silica crystals around it. So you get the sort of in very extreme, very high temperatures, particularly around any steel beam or cast iron beam bearings, where clearly the stone got very hot. Literally there, the stone disintegrates and just ends up as sand. But then the main problem with the stonework is the individual blocks is that they fracture, and they fracture a bit like an onion, in that you get these sort of consistent fracture lines at a certain distance back from the surface, and that distance depends on how hot it was externally. And we found some walls on the back of the building where, when we were dismantling them after the second fire, every single block had a fracture at 4 inches back from the surface. It was almost as if the wall had been sort of cleaved in half. It was
Yeah. It's quite uncanny, that, isn't it? The consistency of depth.
Yeah.
A question from S. Dougal. Following the second fire, was there a need to repeat the previous suite of material tests? Were you able to rely on any of the previous tests, or were there tangible changes which forced a change in approach to the stone, concrete and masonry elements?
We did do it. We have done a lot of repeat testing. Having the first set of test results, though, was extremely useful, because it meant that when we literally walked on site after the first fire or second fire, we had a huge body of knowledge that we understood how individual materials were likely to react. We also actually understood how the structure as a whole would tend to react to a fire. And that certainly enabled us to make some of the very early calls that we were able to make to say, is this building going to fall down or not? Because we had that prior knowledge of how the structure would behave. But on the material testing, knowing the benefits of and the knowledge we'd gained first time around, we basically sort of embarked on sort of retesting sort of everything, whether it's mortars, stone. We did far more extensive testing of the steelwork in particular after the second fire, because we could see it was going to be really important to understand how the steel had behaved, and particularly whether there were steel elements that could be recovered.
Yeah. A question from Nigel Isaacs. Were the top studio windows in both the east and west wings all of timber?
Yeah. The only steel element which is part of the structure, is again on the image on the screen, the sort of heavier elements are actually steel columns. The sort of the structure of the top studios it's a sort of it's a single column and a beam that spans back to a wall at the back of the studios that supports a timber joisted roof, and then has this timber glazed screen. So no bracing. So it's quite a challenging structure, particularly when we came to sort of reconstruct the western half of how we justified it, and how we clearly stopped the windows flexing and leaking.
I noticed that the glass in those windows is is not flat. It's not plate glass. It almost appeared to be cast. Is it?
I think it is plate glass, but it's not. For that period, it's not absolutely flat.
Right.
Yeah, and the sort of kind of the choice of the new glass and the extent of what might be double glazed was a big discussion after the first fire. I think in the end, because of the visual appearance of particularly the top floor studio screens, they were going to be redone as single glaze. The large studio windows were, I think, going to be done double glazed because there was less of an issue, there's less of an appearance issue for those.
Yeah. Right. Well, we really need to stop there, I think, Dominic. We're hemorrhaging participants. But thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to have a much deeper acquaintance with this splendid building that I've ever enjoyed before. Thank you very much, and on behalf of everybody who's joined in, I'd like to say thank you for them as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye now.